Man in Search of Meaning. This book does not aim to provide a report on events and happenings. Rather, it reflects the personal experiences of one man, experiences that millions have touched and suffered through. You could say this book is an account from inside a concentration camp, told by one of those who managed to walk out alive. The story does not dwell on the horrific events that are scarcely known to the public. Instead, it points to the small torments and it dissects them. In other words, our effort in this story is to answer this question. How is the daily life of a concentration camp reflected in the mind of an average person? Our aim here is to dissect, in the light of today's knowledge, the experiences of those who were imprisoned in these camps, and to help those who never set foot inside them to absorb these experiences, and more than that, to touch the experiences of the small percentage of prisoners who survived, and who now find life itself to be so very difficult. Most of the events depicted here did not occur in the large famous camps, but in the smaller ones where most of the mass killings took place. In other words, this story does not deal with the suffering and death of great heroes, or well-known prisoners, or prominent capos, those prisoners who were used as trustees and therefore enjoyed certain privileges. It speaks of the sacrifices of the crucified, the deaths of unknown masses, of criminals of whom we have no record. These were the ordinary prisoners who wore no special insignia on their sleeves, those who were severely despised by the capos, who had never tasted hunger, while the prisoners either had nothing to eat, or barely silenced the cry of their stomachs with a meager ration. And yet the life and livelihoods of many capos were sometimes better than their previous lives. Often the capos behaved more harshly than the guards, beating the prisoners more mercilessly than the SS. It should be noted that capos were chosen from among prisoners whose personalities indicated precisely the kind of behavior the SS expected, and if they acted contrary to those expectations, they were immediately dismissed. The capos quickly adopted the temperament of the SS and the camp guards. So they too can be judged on the basis of psychological principles. Those outside the prison had incorrect notions about the prisoners, because they were under the influence of pity and sentimentality. They were less aware of the struggle that developed and seethed among the prisoners for survival. This struggle, this effort, brutal and merciless, was constantly underway, simply to get one's hands on the daily crust of bread that barely kept you alive. Upon entering the camp, the prisoners' belongings were taken from them. At least this was the method used at Auschwitz, along with everything else they had. Each prisoner was only given the opportunity to choose a false name or profession for themselves, which many did for various reasons. The camp administrators were only interested in the prisoners' numbers. Often, the number was tattooed on the prisoner's body or sewn onto a specific part of their coat or trousers. Any guard who wanted to punish a prisoner only had to glance at his number, and we were terrified of those glances. He didn't need to ask his name. As we noted earlier, the selection process for capos was a negative one, because only the most ruthless prisoners were chosen for this job, although exceptions were sometimes seen. Besides the selection of capos by the SS, there was also a kind of self-reporting. By and large, the only prisoners who could survive were those who, after years of being transferred from camp to camp, and in the struggle to survive, had lost all moral values. They were ready to do anything to save their own lives, whether honorable or dishonorable. They stole, they betrayed their friends, and ultimately used whatever abilities they had, however angry and ruthless. We who by good luck, or fortunate coincidence, or a miracle, or whatever you want to call it, returned from these camps, we know very well that the best of us did not return. Many facts about the events of the labor camps have been reported and written. Here, facts will only have meaning when accompanied by personal experience. Our effort in this book is to explain these experiences. Our aim is to dissect, in the light of today's knowledge, the experiences of those imprisoned in these camps, and to help those who never entered them to absorb these experiences, and more than that, to touch the experiences of the small percentage who survived and now find life so very difficult. These survivors often say, "We hate talking about our experiences. For those who are inside, there's no need to speak." And others will never be able to understand what we felt in those camps, nor can they understand what we feel now. The attempt to provide a research-based examination of this subject is a very difficult task, because psychology must pay attention to a special kind of scientific objectivity. But can someone who is himself a prisoner maintain this objectivity when he writes down his observations and analyses? Such objectivity belongs to those who are outside the camps. But that too would not be free from error, because such a person cannot present material that has real value, since he was not a prisoner, did not see the process, and did not experience it. Therefore, his judgments might be false, and his evaluations far from the mark. So we must strive to avoid any personal bias, and this is the real problem of a book of this kind, because sometimes it seems necessary that a person should have the courage to talk about his personal experiences. Initially, I decided to write this book under a pseudonym, using only my prisoner number. But when the work was finished, I realized that publishing the book with an anonymous author would detract from its value. It is right that I should clearly state all my firm beliefs under my own name, so despite my intense hatred of self-promotion, I have tried to avoid omitting any material from this book. Now it is up to the readers to distill the essence of the book into dry theories, so that perhaps these theories can help the psychology of prison life, which was given attention after the First World War, and which introduced us to the symptoms of the barbed wire sickness. We owe our knowledge of mass psychopathology largely to the Second World War, which added to and enriched our understanding. I recall the famous phrase, the title of a book written by Leon, "War taught us the war of the nerves, and the war of the nerves brought us the concentration camps." This book is important because it is written about my personal experiences as an ordinary prisoner. I proudly note that except for the last few weeks in the camp, I did not work as a prison psychiatrist or even as a doctor. A few of my colleagues had the opportunity to work in first aid, bandaging patients in cold rooms with scraps of waste paper. But my prison number was 119,004, and most of the time I was digging earth to lay railway tracks. Sometimes I worked digging a water tunnel, without the slightest help being given to me. The privilege of actually smoking belonged to the capos, who had weekly rations. Probably prisoners who worked as foremen in warehouses and workshops were given a few cigarettes in return for the dangerous work assigned to them. There was only one exception, those who had lost all hope of living and wanted to enjoy the last days of their lives. So when we saw a friend smoking one cigarette after another, we understood that he had lost his faith in his own power to persevere in life. And when a person lost this faith, the will to live rarely returned, and we considered him lost. When we examine the countless resources that are the result of the observations and experiences of countless prisoners, we can clearly see three phases in the prisoner's psychological reactions to camp life. The first phase is his entry into the prison. The second phase is when the prisoner becomes accustomed to the daily routine of the camp. And the third phase is liberation. The hallmark of the first phase is psychological shock. This shock may even occur in special circumstances before entering the prison. Let me share my own personal experience as an example. Once 500 of us were traveling for several days and nights. 80 people crammed into each wagon. All passengers had to lie down on their belongings, which were all that remained of their possessions. The wagons were so full that there was only an opening above the windows for the gray light of dawn to shine through. Everyone expected the train to end up at an ammunition factory, where we would be forced into hard labor. We didn't know if we were still in Silesia, or if we had reached Poland. The whistle of the train sounded like the cry of someone falling, begging toward nothingness. Then the train switched to another line, and it was clear we were approaching a large station. Suddenly, a cry rang out from among the anxious passengers, the Auschwitz sign. Yes, Auschwitz. The name that made everyone's hair stand on end. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, the mass killings. The train moved so slowly with such a deadly deliberation, as if to stretch out the moments of horror caused by approaching Auschwitz longer than they already were. Auschwitz, with the rising of the sun in the pale dawn, the view of this terrifying camp appeared. Rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, revolving searchlights, and long lines of wretched, sorrowful prisoners. The prisoners dragged themselves with difficulty along the straight roads. We did not know towards which destination they were moving. The sound of commands, of shouting, reached our ears. We couldn't make sense of these sounds. My imagination took my eyes to see gallows with the bodies of prisoners swinging from them. I was horrified, and this indicated that step by step we would have to become familiar with unbounded, horrific terror, and we would have to get used to it. Finally, we arrived at the station. The previous silence was shattered by the shouts of the commanders. From then on, we were condemned to live with those ear-splitting harsh screams. And again, in all the camps, our ears would be tormented by them. The voices of the commanders were a torment to the soul, like the last cry of a condemned man, seeming to leap from the throat of a man who was forced to scream that way, a man who was being killed and killed again.
The train doors opened, and a small group of prisoners stormed into the compartments. These prisoners wore striped uniforms and had shaved heads, but they seemed to be well nourished. They spoke in European languages, amusingly, which seemed strange under the circumstances. My innate optimism, which, like a drowning man clutching at a straw, has often controlled my feelings even in the worst conditions, planted this thought in my mind. Apparently, these prisoners seemed perfectly fine, good-humored, even laughing. Who knows, perhaps I too could share in their good living conditions. In psychiatry, there is a state called the delusion of reprieve. A man condemned to death, a moment before the sentence is carried out, develops this delusion that he will probably be reprieved at the last moment. We had such a state, and we clung to the smallest hope, thinking until the very last moment that it would turn out all right. The rosy cheeks and fleshy faces of those prisoners alone gave us courage and nourished the seed of hope in our hearts. At the time, we didn't know that they were selected to receive the new prisoners who arrived daily. Almost everyone on that train with us had the delusion that they would be reprieved at the last moment, and everything would return to normal. We did not understand what was happening behind the scenes, or what awaited us. We were told to leave our luggage in the train and stand in two lines, women on one side, men on the other, to pass in front of the SS officers. Fortunately, I had the courage to hide my backpack under my coat. One by one, our group passed before the SS officer. I felt that if the officer's eye fell on my backpack, it would be very dangerous. From previous experience, I knew he would at least knock me to the ground. So, as I got closer to the officer, I walked with an erect posture, so he wouldn't notice my heavy load. Now we were face to face. The officer was a tall, thin man with a chic uniform. He seemed to be in contrast to us who had traveled a long way and had disheveled, sullen faces. His expression was calm and indifferent. With his left hand, he held his right elbow. His right hand would rise, and with the index finger of that same hand, he would carelessly point to the right or left. None of us knew the meaning of his hand gesture, sometimes to the right, mostly to the left. My turn came. Someone whispered in my ear, "Those sent to the right will be assigned to work. Those directed to the left are sick people who are unable to work and will be sent to a special camp." I waited to see what my fate would be, and this was only the beginning of the many problems I would face in the future. The weight of my backpack tilted me slightly to the left, but I tried to walk upright. The SS officer scanned my eyebrows. I read hesitation on his face. Then he put his hands on my shoulders. I struggled to make my face look strong, until he gently turned my shoulders and directed me to the right, and I moved in that direction. That very night, they explained the meaning of this finger game to us. This was the first selection: to be or not to be, to live or to perish. For most of our companions, about 90%, a death sentence was issued, and that sentence was carried out within a few hours. Those sent to the left were sent directly from the station to the crematoriums. As one of the workers there told me, the word bathhouse was written on the doors of the ovens in several European languages. Upon entering, the prisoners were given a bar of soap. I don't think I need to explain what happened there. Much has already been written about that horrific scene. The few of us who had escaped death realized the truth that night. I asked a prisoner who had been there for a while, which direction was my friend and colleague sent. He was sent to the left. Can you see him there? With his hand, he pointed to a chimney a few hundred meters away. A column of flame was licking the gray sky of Poland. He meant, "My friend has turned into a cloud of smoke. That's where your friends are floating in heaven." But I still didn't understand the meaning of these words until they explained them to me in simple terms. I'm getting off track. Better to relate the events in order. From a psychological point of view, from that pale dawn when we arrived at the station until our first rest in the camp, we had a long path ahead of us. While armed SS officers escorted us, we had to run from the station, past the electrified barbed wire, through the camp, to reach the bathhouse. For those of us who had passed the first selection, this was a real bath. Once again, the delusion of reprieve took hold of us. The SS officers seemed likable, and we soon realized why. As long as we had watches, and they could tame us with flattery to take our watches, they were good. Wouldn't it be better to give them to them? And why shouldn't these handsome officers have watches? Perhaps someday they would repay us for this generosity. We waited in a shack that seemed to be the waiting room of the disinfection section. The officers came and spread a blanket on the floor, onto which we had to empty all our belongings, watches, jewelry. Among us there were still naive people who asked the seasoned prisoners who had come to help us, "Can I keep my wedding ring, or a lucky charm?" No one had yet realized that they would take everything from us. I tried to gain the trust of one of the prisoners. I secretly went to him, pointed to the rolled-up papers in the inner pocket of my coat, and said, "Look, this is the manuscript of a scientific book. I know, what are you going to tell me? I should be very happy if I get out of here alive, and that should be the only thing I expect from my fate. But I can't think about these things. I have to keep this manuscript at any price. This manuscript is the result of my work. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Yes, he seemed to understand what I was saying. A slow smile spread across his face. First an amused smile, then a mocking one, then an insulting one, and finally, it took the shape of a word that echoed in the air, a crude word. The repetition of that word was common in the camp among the prisoners. It was at that moment that I saw the naked truth, and it did something that placed a branding iron on the peak of the first phase of my psychological reaction. I said goodbye to my former life. Suddenly, a commotion arose among my fellow travelers. They stood with pale faces and terrified expressions, speaking in utter defenselessness. Again, the harsh roars of the commanders tormented our ears. We were pushed into the waiting room of the bathhouse. There we gathered around an SS officer. He waited until we were all inside, then said, "From my watch you have 2 minutes to get completely undressed. Put everything you have on the floor right where you're standing. You will take nothing with you except your shoes, belt, trouser straps, and suspenders. Your time starts now." The prisoners undressed without the slightest hesitation. As the end of the 2 minutes approached, their nervousness increased. They clumsily took off their undershirts and belts, untying their shoelaces. Then we heard the first sound of the whip, leather whips falling on the naked bodies of the prisoners. After that, they herded us like cattle into a room where the hair on our bodies was shaved off. Not only our heads, but not a single hair was left anywhere on our bodies. Then it was time to take a shower, and here, we stood in line once more. We could barely recognize each other, but now, some prisoners touched the real fine spray of water on their bodies with great calmness. As we waited our turn, we realized that our naked bodies were all that remained. We had lost everything, even the shortest hair. Our naked bodies were our only possession. Truly, what else remained to connect us to our former lives? For me, only my glasses and my belt remained, and I lost my belt for a piece of bread. Those with suspenders became excited because that night, the senior prisoner in charge of our hut welcomed us with a speech and swore on his honor that if anyone had hidden money or jewels in their suspenders, he would personally hang them from the post he pointed to. He proudly explained that camp rules gave him that right as a resident of the camp. Having good shoes in the camp was an important matter. Although we had to take care of them, those with relatively good shoes had to hand them over to the authorities and receive in return a pair that didn't fit. Prisoners who had listened to the compassionate advice of the responsible prisoners in the waiting room and cut the tops of their boots, rubbing soap on the cuts to hide them, got into real trouble. Apparently the SS officers were waiting for just that. Those who had committed this crime were taken to the next room, and for a long time we heard the sound of the whip and their screams. This torture went on for a long time. One by one our illusions and delusions were shattered, and after that, unexpectedly, we became good-humored. We knew very well that we had nothing left to lose but our ridiculous lives and our naked bodies. When the shower water came on, we all tried to make fun of ourselves and each other. Apart from this newfound humor, another feeling arose in us: curiosity. I'd experienced this kind of curiosity before as a basic reaction to exceptional situations, once when my life was in danger during a mountaineering accident. In that critical moment I had only one feeling: curiosity. Curiosity as to whether I would survive or return with a broken skull and a wounded body. This same dry curiosity prevailed in Auschwitz, diverting our minds from our surroundings in a way that we encountered objectively. At the time, we reinforced this mental state as a means of self-protection. We were interested to know what the next event would be. For example, what would be the result of us standing in the open air, naked and half dry after our shower, in the freezing late autumn. A few days later, our curiosity gave way to astonishment. We were astonished that we didn't catch cold. New arrivals were constantly astonished. First, the doctors among us realized that all the textbooks were lying. The books said a human being cannot stay awake except for a limited number of hours. That is completely false. I was convinced that I was incapable of doing certain things. For example, I couldn't sleep without this or that, or live with this or that person. On the first night in Auschwitz, we slept on plank beds, arranged in rows. In each row, which was 2 to 2.5 meters long, 9 of us slept on the wooden floor. 9 people shared 2 blankets. I should mention that we all had to sleep on our sides, which forced us to sleep huddled together, thus somewhat escaping the bitter cold. Although it was forbidden to bring shoes into the dormitory, some prisoners used their shoes, muddy as they were, as pillows. Otherwise, you would have to rest your head on your numb hand. Despite all the painful conditions, we fell asleep and entered a world of oblivion for a few hours, free from pain and suffering. Let me tell you a few examples of our own hardiness in the face of difficulties. We couldn't brush our teeth, yet despite the vitamin deficiency, our gums were healthier than before. We had to wear a shirt for 6 months until it fell apart. Because the water pipes were frozen, we couldn't wash ourselves, or even part of ourselves. Yet the wounds on our hands, covered in dirt and grime, didn't fester. Frostbite was a separate issue. Another example, those who were light sleepers and would startle at the slightest sound from the next room could now sleep soundly next to a friend who snored loudly. If anyone asks us now about the truth of Dostoevsky's statement that man is a creature who can get used to anything, we will answer, yes, man is a creature who can get used to anything. But don't ask us how. Neither our psychological analyses, nor we prisoners had reached that stage yet, because we were still in the initial phase of psychological reactions. The thought of suicide crossed almost everyone's mind. We all experienced this thought, if only for a short time. It was born of our situation, the constant threat of death, the proximity of death for those who were tortured. Due to my firm belief, which I will mention later, on the first night of my arrival at the camp, I made a pact with myself not to run into the barbed wire. This was the phrase used in the camp for the best method of suicide, by touching the electrified barbed wire. Making such a decision was not without its problems for me. Since the chances of survival or of events leading to liberation were low, suicide lost its meaning. No one was sure they would be among those who survived all the selections. The prisoners of Auschwitz, in the first phase of psychological shock, were not afraid of death. Even the gas chamber lost its horror after the first few days. Friends I saw later told me, I wasn't one of those who became depressed upon entering the camp. When the following event occurred the morning after our arrival at Auschwitz, I just smiled. The story is this. Despite warnings not to leave the huts, a friend of mine who had entered Auschwitz a few weeks earlier came secretly to our hut. His intention was to give us a few small pieces of advice to bring us mental peace. He had lost so much weight that we didn't recognize him at first. He cheerfully and with a hasty indifference reminded us of a few points and left. Don't be scared, boys. Don't be afraid of the selection. Dr. Mumm, the head of the SS medical staff, is good to doctors. This lie and these friendly words of my friend were misleading. A prisoner who was a doctor for several huts, about 60 years old, had told me how he had begged Dr. Mumm to spare his son from the gas chamber, but Dr. Mumm had coldly rejected his request. My friend continued, "Please boys, shave your face every day, even if you have to use a piece of glass. Shave, even if it costs you your last piece of bread. That way you'll look younger and your cheeks will be rosier. If you want to stay alive, there's only one way. You have to be able to work. Suppose you have a blister on your heel and you limp, and an SS officer sees you. He'll kill you on the spot. You can be sure the gas chamber awaits you the next day. Do you know what we mean by Muslim? A man with a pathetic face, just skin and bones, who can no longer do hard physical work. He is a Muslim. Sooner or later, usually very soon, he is sent to the gas chamber. So remember to shave and walk upright. Then you won't need to be afraid of the gas chamber. All of you standing here, even if you've only been here for 24 hours, shouldn't be afraid of the gas chamber." He pointed to me and continued, "I hope you don't mind my bluntness." Then he turned to the others and said, "Out of all of you, he's the only one who should be afraid of the next election. So you others don't worry." I smiled, and now I am convinced that anyone else in my place would have done the same thing that day. It's what Lichtenberg said. Sometimes events cause you to lose your logic. Not that you have any reason to lose it, because an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. We psychiatrists even expect that a person's reactions to something abnormal, like being sent to an insane asylum, will be abnormal relative to his degree of normality. The reaction of a person who has entered a concentration camp also shows his abnormal mental state. But if we look at this issue objectively, under the existing circumstances, such a reaction is, as we shall see later, a normal and authentic reaction. As I explained earlier, these reactions reverse themselves within a few days. The prisoner moved from the first phase to the second phase. The second phase was a phase of relative apathy, a kind of emotional death. Apart from the reactions I've described so far, the new prisoners experienced even more painful emotional torments. They struggled to destroy them all within themselves. First, they yearned for home and family. This longing sometimes put such pressure on the prisoner that he felt it was eating away at his very being. Another feeling was hatred. Hatred for all the ugliness around him, even in its external form. But the prisoner who had reached the second phase of psychological reactions no longer averted his eyes when his friend was punished, because at this stage his feelings had become calloused. He watched the scene without the slightest emotion. Indifference and the numbing of emotions, a state where a person no longer cares about anything. These were the signs that appeared in the second phase of the prisoner's psychological reactions. Eventually they made him indifferent to the moment-to-moment and daily torture of others. And it was this hardening, this indifference, that allowed the prisoner to soon build a wall around himself. Any movement could result in a beating. Sometimes we were beaten for no reason. For example, bread was rationed at our workplace, and we had to stand in line to receive it. Once a prisoner behind me stood a little out of line. This breaking of symmetry displeased the SS officer. I didn't know what was happening behind me, nor what was going through the guard's mind. Suddenly, 2 heavy blows fell on my head. At that moment, I saw the guard hitting me with a stick. In such a moment, it is not the physical pain that strikes a person. This is as true for punishing children as it is for adults. Rather, it is the mental anguish arising from the injustice, and generally, the illogicality of it all that is so tormenting. What is astonishing is that a blow that leaves no mark can, under special circumstances, be more painful than one that does. Fortunately, the capo in our group felt indebted to me. He had grown fond of me because I listened to his love affairs and family troubles. He would tell me his stories during the long walks to the worksite. Through understanding him, my perception of his personality, and psychoanalytic advice, I gained influence over him. After that, he was grateful to me, and this was valuable to me. He would often reserve a place for me next to him in one of the first 5 rows of the line, which usually consisted of 280 people. This was the ultimate expression of his kindness. As long as the capo needed my emotional support, I was safe. My guaranteed honorary place was next to him. But this friendship had another advantage. Like all prisoners, I suffered from edema. My legs were so swollen, the skin stretched so tight, that I could barely move my knees. To put my shoes on my swollen feet, I had to leave them unlaced. Even if I had socks, I couldn't wear them because my shoes wouldn't fit. So my bare feet, half exposed, were always wet, and my shoes were full of snow. Of course, our feet were always frostbitten and swollen, so every step was painful. During the long marches, my shoes would fill with snow. As a result, prisoners constantly slipped, and those behind them would fall on top of each other. Then this column of flesh would stop for a moment, no longer. In such cases, the guards didn't hesitate and struck the prisoners with the butts of their rifles to get them back up. Naturally, those at the front of the line had to stop less often and didn't have to run on painful feet to catch up. Again, I was fortunate. Because I had become the special doctor to the esteemed capo, I marched at the front of the line with slow steps. Moreover, I was assured that my capo, in gratitude for the service I rendered him, would, when it was my turn for the lunch soup, dip the ladle to the bottom of the pot and pour some peas into my bowl. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman, with whom he was on bad terms, that I was an exceptionally good worker. True, these compliments didn't fill my hand, but they did save my life. This was one of several instances that saved my life. The day after my argument with the foreman, he secretly sent me to another work group. There were also foremen who sympathized with us, and tried at least to provide some facilities in the workplace. The apathy, the most important symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Gradually, reality weakened, and all efforts and emotions revolved around a single issue: staying alive and protecting any remaining friends. In the evenings, when the prisoners were herded back from the worksite to the camp, you could hear them say, "Well, another day has passed." You can well understand that the constant pressure, the constant struggle to survive, caused the prisoners' mental state to sink to a very low level. Several of my colleagues in the camp, who had training in psychoanalysis, often spoke of regression among the prisoners. Regression means a return to a primitive type of mental life. At such a stage, the prisoner dreams of his wishes and desires. What kind of dreams did the prisoners have? They dreamed of bread, pastries, cigarettes, a good warm bath. Because these wishes were not fulfilled in waking life, they appeared in the form of dreams. Whether seeing these dreams was beneficial or not is another matter. The prisoner, upon waking, had to face the reality of camp life and its horrifying contrast with the illusions and compensations of the dream. Naturally, due to the insufficient food, zero in quality and quantity, from which the prisoners suffered, the wish for a good meal had become the primary basic instinct, constantly occupying the prisoners' minds. Now let's go and visit the prisoners while they are working. They are close to each other, and coincidentally no one is watching them. Immediately they start talking about food. One prisoner in the ditch asks another what his favorite dish is, and then they exchange recipes for dishes they could cook. They mentally prepare the menu for the day of their liberation, the day when in the distant future, they will be freed from their chains and return to their homes. They talked about food in such detail, until suddenly a whispered word or a number passed from mouth to mouth. The guard is coming. When the last layers of our body fat melted away, and we became skeletons wearing rags, we had to witness our bodies wasting away. Our bodies were digesting their own protein, our muscles disappeared, and the body no longer had the strength to resist. The members of our small community died one after another. Each of us could expertly say whose turn it was next, and when the camel would sleep in our own tent. With all the death and dying we witnessed, we knew the signs of death well, and our predictions were quite accurate. We would whisper to each other, "He won't make it," or "It's his turn now." At night, when we would search ourselves for lice, according to the daily routine, and look at our naked bodies, we would think, what has happened to us? Is this body, which is no more than a corpse, our body? We were nothing but a lump of a vast human mass. A vast mass behind barbed wire, herded into clay huts. A mass, part of which rotted and decayed every day because it was no longer alive. Earlier I mentioned how thinking about food and favorite dishes tormented the prisoner's brains like a sore. This was unavoidable. This thought occupied the conscious mind of every prisoner at every moment of his waking life. Perhaps you can understand that even the strongest of us yearned for the day when we would eat relatively well again. And this longing was not really for the food itself, but for the day when that subhuman life, in which we thought of nothing but food, would collapse. Those who have not experienced such stages can hardly imagine the mental conflict that destroys the spirit, the conflicts of the willpower of a man who has experienced hunger. Nor will they ever understand what it means to stand alone, digging a ditch, listening for the whistle that signals 9:30 or 10 in the morning. We had only half an hour of rest, and during that time they distributed our bread ration, if there was any bread at all. They would frequently ask the foreman about our behavior, and we constantly asked for the time, and with encouragement, we would touch our piece of bread in our coat pocket. First, we would hold it in our frostbitten, gloveless fingers like something precious. Then we would break off a piece and put it in our mouths, and finally, with the last ounce of willpower, we would put it back in our pocket, vowing to keep it until evening. Can anyone understand the meaning of all that I have recalled? We constantly discussed the meaningfulness or meaninglessness of the special methods of eating that one tiny piece of bread, either all at once or bit by bit. This was the bread that in a later period of the camp was given to us only once a day. There were two types of thinking among the prisoners. One was to eat the entire bread ration at once. This had two advantages. It eased the pain of hunger, at least for a short while, and it protected the bread from possible theft or ration shortfall.
The other group divided their ration and ate it in several portions, giving various reasons. I eventually joined them.
The most terrible moments in the 24 hours of camp life were the waking hours, because they would tear us from our sleep at gray dawn with the sound of 3 whistles. They would mercilessly separate us from our sleep, born of extreme fatigue and sweet dreams. And it was at this time that we had to struggle with our wet shoes, into which we could barely fit our painful, swollen feet. Of course, the usual swearing and grumbling could be heard, caused by using wire instead of shoelaces. One morning, I heard the sound of someone crying, a man I knew as brave and dignified. This man was crying like a child because, after a great struggle with his shoes, which had become too small, and unable to fit his swollen feet into them, he had been forced to walk barefoot in the snow. In such terrible moments, I would find some calm, take my bread ration from my pocket, and with great appetite, enjoy its crumbs. Poor nutrition and constantly thinking about different foods probably explain why our sexual urges had mostly disappeared. Apart from the effects of the initial psychological shock, this was the only interpretation a psychologist should pay attention to regarding this phenomenon in men's camps. Unlike all other male-only institutions like the army, sexual deviation was rare in the concentration camp. The prisoner didn't even pay attention to sexual matters in his sleep, while his frustrated higher sentiments manifested in his dreams. Most prisoners, hardened by a primitive life and the struggle to save their lives, were indifferent to anything not connected to this goal, showing how their feelings and emotions had been humiliated. Generally, a kind of cultural stagnation was observed in the camp. There were, of course, 2 exceptions: politics and religion. I can almost say that politics was constantly discussed in all camps. The discussions were mainly based on rumors. A rumor would leak from somewhere and quickly take root throughout the camp. The religious interests of the prisoners, which took hold quickly, showed a sincerity that is hard to imagine. The depth and strength of their faith often astonished new arrivals. What was most moving in this regard were the prayers and religious ceremonies that the prisoners invented themselves, held in a corner of a hut or in the darkness of a locked truck meant for cattle, a truck that would take us back to the camp from a remote work site, tired and hungry, frozen in our ragged societies. Despite being condemned to a primitive mental and physical life in the labor camp, it was possible for us to become hardened in the depths of our spiritual life as well. Perhaps sensitive people, accustomed to a rich intellectual life, suffered more than others. These people often had delicate physical builds, but their inner lives were less damaged than others. They could escape from the horrific environment back to their rich inner life. For this reason alone, one can understand the apparent paradox that many weak and seemingly incapable prisoners often endured camp life better than those who were strong. To clarify this for myself, I must return to my personal experiences. Let me tell you what happened on those gray early mornings when we had to walk to our work site. The command "Step forward" was issued with a shout from the commander. Left, 2, 3, 4. Left, 2, 3, 4. Left, 2, 3, 4. First row move. Left, 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 and left. Hats off. I can still hear those words ringing in my ears. When the command "hats off" was given, we passed through the camp gate, and the revolving searchlights swept over us. Woe to the person who, because of the cold, had pulled his hat over his ears before permission was given to put it on. In the hardships of the camp, a thought blossomed within me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth that so many poets have sung about, and so many thinkers have declared as the ultimate wisdom, the truth that love is the highest and ultimate goal that humanity yearns for. And it was here that I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry, thought, and belief must reveal. Human salvation is through love, and in love. On that morning, in that state, I understood that even if everything is taken from a person, if only one thing remains, they can still be happy, by thinking of their beloved. In extreme helplessness, when a man can do no positive thing, when the only worthy action is to bear his suffering with dignity, in such a state, he can keep himself satisfied and happy with the loving image of his beloved in his mind. On that morning, I understood for the first time the meaning of the saying that the angels are forever lost in the contemplation of infinite glory. At that moment, it occurred to me that love transcends the physical existence of the beloved and finds its true meaning in their spiritual being, their inner self, whether they are present or not, alive or dead. I did not know if my wife was alive or not, and there was no way to find out, for during my captivity, no letters went in or out. But at that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing could diminish the power of my love or blur her imaginary image. Even if I had known then that she was dead, perhaps her ethereal image would have remained unchanged, and that spiritual conversation would have been just as clear and beautiful. Place me like a seal over your heart, for love is as strong as death. This focus on inner life, living with oneself, was a refuge and a help for the prisoners. It brought them some relief from their humiliated existence and spiritual poverty. And by returning to the past, they forgot the present. When the mind was free, imagination played with past events. Upon liberation, his imagination would wander through past events, often unimportant, even trivial. His yearning mind would magnify those events, giving them strange properties, while the prisoner's world and existence were far removed from them. Their souls would penetrate it with longing and desire, and be moved. In my imagination, I would take a bus and go home. I would open the door to my apartment, turn on the lights, and answer the phone. Our thoughts went even to such details, and these memories could bring us to tears. As the prisoner's inner life deepened, he experienced the beauty of art and nature more profoundly, and it was at such a stage that a prisoner, through the real experience of them, would sometimes even forget his own horrific situation. If anyone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to the Bavarian camp, how greedily and ravenously our eyes devoured the Salzburg mountains and castles shining in the sun through the small barred windows of the prison wagon. They would never have believed that these faces belonged to men who had lost all hope of life and freedom. Despite this factor, or perhaps because of it, we were mesmerized by the beauty of nature, from which we had been separated for so long. In the last violent protest against approaching death, I felt my spirit break through the darkness and rise. I felt my soul soar from that vain and meaningless world. And from somewhere I heard the victorious answer yes to my question, is there a purpose in creation? At that moment, a light went on in a village hut in the distance, a light on the horizon, like a painting on a canvas on that gray Bavarian morning, a light shining in the darkness. It has been clearly observed that humor, more than anything else in the human constitution, can separate a person from their harsh situation and give them the strength to rise above any hardship and ugliness, even if only for a few seconds. I was able to teach one of my friends, who worked next to me in a building, how to acquire a sense of humor. I suggested that we decide to make up at least one amusing story a day about an event that might happen one day after our liberation. My friend was a surgeon and the deputy of a large hospital. Once I tried to make him laugh and said, "How might you get rid of the habits of camp life?" At the construction site, especially when an inspector came, the foreman would encourage us with shouts of get moving, to work faster. I told my friend, one day you will return to your former hospital. While you are in the middle of a delicate surgery, the operating room door will burst open, and suddenly the hospital foreman will rush in and announce the arrival of the chief surgeon with a shout of get moving, get moving. Sometimes other prisoners would make up interesting stories about the future. For example, they would imagine a night when they were invited to dinner, but they would forget where they were. When they were served soup, they would beg the host to scrape the bottom of the pot and give them some soup that had a few peas in it. When a person tries to learn the art of living, this effort, turning to a spirit of humor and wit to tolerate the living conditions around them, becomes an amazing trick. This trick can be used even in a concentration camp, despite the constant suffering. It's better to analyze the matter. Human suffering is like the behavior of gas. If a certain amount of gas is pumped into an empty room, no matter how large the room, the pump will fill it completely and equally. Therefore, suffering, whether great or small, will distress the human soul and consciousness. So we can say that the amount of human suffering is completely relative. For this reason, it can be said that a very small event can cause the greatest joys. The small pleasures of camp life gave us a kind of negative happiness, as Schopenhauer called it, freedom from suffering. And even that was only relative. Real positive joys, even small ones, were very rare. I remember one day I made a list of my joys, and upon reviewing it, realized that over many past weeks, I had only experienced 2 pleasant moments. One was the day when, on our way back from the workshop, I was allowed, after much waiting, to go to the camp kitchen and stand in line where the prisoner cook was giving out rations. The cook stood behind a large pot. He poured a ladle of soup into the bowl of each prisoner who passed by. He was the only cook who didn't look at the faces of the prisoners he was serving, the only cook who gave soup equally to everyone, without regard to who the prisoner was. He treated even his friends or townspeople the same, not giving them potatoes and others thin soup. I don't want to judge the prisoners who favored their friends and showed discrimination. Who can blame a man for prioritizing his friends in conditions where, sooner or later, the question of life or death is at stake? No one has the right to judge unless they honestly ask themselves whether they would have done differently in that person's place. A long time after I returned to normal life, long after my liberation, someone showed me an illustrated weekly magazine with pictures of prisoners lying in their bunks, staring dazed and bewildered at the ladle. He asked, "Aren't these blank, terrified stares horrible?" I asked why, because I didn't understand his point. At that moment, my past life came alive again. It was 5 a.m., still gray twilight outside. I was lying on a hard wooden plank in a clay hut. We were sick, and for the next few weeks, we wouldn't have to leave the camp for forced labor. We didn't have to march. We could lie in a corner of the hut all day, dozing, waiting for our daily ration, which, of course, was smaller for the sick. Thinner soup, less of it. Despite all this, how content we were. Despite the terrible living conditions, we were still content. When we were packed together like spoons so our body heat wouldn't escape. So lazy and listless that we didn't want to move a finger unnecessarily. We could hear the ear-splitting whistles and shouts of the guards from the parade ground where they were assembling for the night roll call. The door burst open and a snowstorm rushed into the hut. A tired, dejected friend covered in snow stumbled in and sat down for a few moments, but the senior guard sent him back out. When the prisoner count was being checked, we had no right to let a stranger into our hut. At that moment, how I pitied him, and how happy I was that this hadn't happened to me, and that instead, I could doze in my bed in the sick ward. 2 days of rest in the ward, and probably 2 more days to be extended, was like an angel of liberation. All the stories I've told you came to life in my mind when I saw those photos. When I spoke to them about camp life, they understood why I didn't find the photos so horrible. After all, perhaps those who experienced camp life weren't so unhappy after all. On the 4th day of my rest in the sick ward, I was assigned to night guard duty. Just then, the head doctor rushed into the hut and asked me to volunteer for medical work in another camp that had typhus patients. Contrary to the insistent advice of my friends, and despite the fact that none of my colleagues were willing to cooperate, I decided to volunteer, because I knew that the forced labor they would put me through would soon kill me. But if I died in the medical ward, at least my death would have some meaning. I thought without a doubt, if I can help my friends as a doctor, I will have a purpose. While, if I continued a vegetative life, or ultimately died as a useless laborer, I wouldn't cure any pain. In my view, this was a simple calculation, not a sacrifice. However, the officer in charge of the medical ward had secretly ordered that 2 doctors who volunteered for the typhus ward should be protected. We had become so weak that the officer was afraid he would end up with 2 extra corpses instead of 2 doctors. As I mentioned earlier, anything that wasn't directly related to our own survival or that of our close friends was worthless to us. Everything had to be sacrificed to this goal, survival. The individual's personality was so caught up in this goal that he lost his mental balance to the point where all his values were threatened, or at least called into question. In a world that no longer valued human life or dignity, that sought to break his will and turn him into a beast of burden for destruction, planning to use him in every way possible and extract the last ounce of his strength. In these conditions, the person himself ultimately suffers from the loss of his values. If a man in the concentration camp did not fight against the destruction of his values, and did not struggle to maintain his self-respect, he would lose the feeling of being human, a human with a brain, inner freedom, and personal worth. He would become just a part of a vast mass, his existence sinking to the level of an animal. The prisoners were herded like cattle at every moment, sometimes all together, sometimes separately, like a flock of sheep that neither thinks nor has a will of its own. The small but dangerous group, familiar with all methods of torture and abuse, watched the prisoners from all sides. They constantly drove the herd forward and back with shouts, kicks, and blows, and we sheep thought of only two things: how to escape the jaws of the rabid dogs, and how to get a meager piece of bread to survive. Just like sheep that huddle miserably in the middle of the flock, each of us also tried to find our way into the middle of the prisoners, because that way we were safe from the blows of the guards who moved along the sides, back, and front of the fleshy column. Being in the center also had the advantage of being protected from the biting cold. To put it simply, being in the center of the mass was a struggle for survival. We did this automatically, but at other times we tried, according to the camp's compulsory rules and to save our lives, not to be conspicuous. We constantly tried not to attract the attention of the SS. Experience in the camp showed that whenever they wanted to eliminate a group, they would separate them as volunteers from the rest. Volunteers for medical work or services. During my time too, the guards once came and made such a request. Those who volunteer for medical work in another camp, step forward. Despite the insistence of close and distant friends to dissuade me, I volunteered. My intention was to accept my fate in another camp where I was needed as a medical volunteer. But the sad and interesting part of this story was that this time, the camp authorities had made the opposite decision. This time, they had decided to take the volunteers and lead those who had not risked volunteering, who had not wanted to help, to their deaths. Doesn't this situation bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? The story goes that once a rich and powerful Iranian man was walking in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried out that he had seen Azrael, who had threatened him. The servant begged his master to give him his fastest horse so he could flee to Tehran. He could reach Tehran by sunset that evening. The master agreed. The servant galloped away towards Tehran. Upon returning home, the master saw Azrael and asked him, "Why did you threaten and frighten my servant?" Azrael replied, "I did not threaten him. I was only surprised to see him still here, when I was supposed to meet him in Tehran tonight." The camp prisoners were terrified of making any kind of decision. This was because of their strong feeling that fate was decisive, and man should not play with it, but rather welcome whatever comes. Moreover, apathy had overcome and dominated all the prisoners' emotions. Sometimes we had to make lightning-fast decisions that meant life or death, but even in such moments the prisoner preferred to submit to his fate. This avoidance of any decision was most striking when the prisoner had to decide whether to escape or not. In such highly sensitive moments, when minutes counted, he would suffer mental torture and remain hesitant, unsure whether to risk his life and escape or not. I had a chance to escape. The story is that one of my colleagues had to leave the camp to see patients, a medical mission. He wanted to escape at that time and wanted me to come with him. On the pretext of a medical consultation for a patient whose illness required a specialist's opinion, he got me out of the camp. The plan was that, outside the camp, a member of the external resistance movement would give us clothes and documents. At the last minute, due to technical problems, we had to return to the camp. We took the opportunity to take some rotten potatoes and a backpack. On the way, we made it to the women's camp and into a hut. The camp was empty because the women had been sent to another camp. The hut was like a shambles, everything in disarray. Apparently, the women had gathered some odds and ends and then had to evacuate. There were ragged clothes, rotten food, broken dishes. There were a few intact bowls that could be useful, but we decided not to take them. Later we heard that when things got critical, these bowls were used not only for food, but also as chamber pots. Although bringing any kind of dish into the hut was forbidden, sometimes some prisoners had to break the rules, especially typhus patients who were too weak to go outside the hut to the latrine, even if someone helped them. While I was on guard outside the hut, my friend went inside. After a short time, he came out with a backpack hidden under his coat. Now it was my turn to go inside and get another backpack that my friend had seen. I went in and searched through the rubble. I found the backpack. I even got a toothbrush, and suddenly, among all the things the women had left behind, I saw a woman's corpse. I hurried back to our hut to gather my belongings: a food bowl, a pair of worn-out gloves I had taken from a dead male typhus patient, and a few pieces of paper on which I had written my notes. As I mentioned, I had rewritten the notes I had lost in Auschwitz. For the last time, I visited my patients. They were lying on rotten planks on either side of the hut.
I went to the bedside of my only fellow countryman.
I had tried very hard to save his life, but his condition was critical, and he was nearing death.
I had no intention of telling anyone about my escape plan, but apparently my friend had guessed.
Maybe my expression was nervous. In a tired voice, he asked me, "Are you leaving this place too?" I denied it, but it was hard to escape his sorrowful gaze. After I had checked on all the patients, I returned to him and again faced his accusing look. After I told my friend that I too would escape with him, an unpleasant feeling clawed at my insides, growing deeper by the moment. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands, just for once, and control it. I ran outside the hut and told my friend that I couldn't go with him. As soon as I firmly told my friend that I wanted to stay with my patients, that sick feeling left me. I didn't know what the coming days would bring, but I felt an inner peace I had never experienced before. I returned to the hut, sat down next to my fellow countryman on the planks, and tried to calm him. Then I chatted with the other patients, trying to comfort them in their suffering. The last day of our stay in the camp arrived. The closer the battlefronts came to the camp, the more the prisoners were transferred in droves to other camps. The camp authorities preferred to evacuate the capos. On such a day, the order was given that the camp must be completely evacuated by sunset. Even the few prisoners who remained, the sick, a few doctors and nurses, were forced to leave, so that they could set the camp on fire during the night. There was still no sign of the truck that was supposed to come in the afternoon to take the sick to another camp. Instead, the camp gates were locked, and the guard around the barbed wire was intensified so that no one could escape. It seemed that the remaining prisoners were condemned to be burned in the camp. My friend and I decided once again to escape. We were ordered to bury a prisoner outside the camp, behind the barbed wire. We were the only two strong enough to do such a thing. Almost everyone else was in bed in the few huts still in use, struggling with fever and delirium. Now we had another plan in mind. To carry the corpse, we used an old wheelbarrow as a coffin, in which we could also hide our backpacks. With the second corpse, we would take the backpacks, and we planned to escape with the third corpse. Our work went according to plan for the first two corpses. Everything was on track. After we returned, my friend went to get a piece of bread so we could survive for a few days in the forests. I waited. Minutes passed, and I still waited. As time passed and my friend didn't return, I grew more impatient. After 3 years of camp life, I was cheerfully imagining the taste of freedom. I thought how wonderful it would be to head towards the battlefront, but things didn't get that far. Just as my friend returned, the camp gate opened. A shiny, lead-colored car with a Red Cross sign on it slowly rolled onto the parade ground. A representative of the International Red Cross in Geneva had arrived. Now the camp and the prisoners were under his protection. The representative took up residence in a village house to be near the camp in case of any danger. Now who was thinking of escape? Packages of medicine were unloaded from the car, cigarettes were distributed, photos were taken of us, and joy rained down from heaven and earth. These were blessed moments. Now there was no need to risk our lives and go to the front. In our excitement, we had forgotten about the third corpse. Finally, we took the corpse out and put it in the grave we had dug for 3 bodies. The guard who accompanied us, a relatively harmless person, suddenly became a gentle man. He thought the tables might turn, and gaining our favor for a future rainy day would certainly be useful to him. Before we threw the earth on the bodies, we prayed, and he joined us in prayer. After all the emotions and pressures of those hard, dark days, days over which we finally triumphed over death, the words of our prayer were the brightest and most sincere words rising from within us for peace and tranquility. And so we spent the last day of the camp hoping for freedom. But apparently we had celebrated victory too soon. Because although the Red Cross representative assured us that the peace treaty had been signed and the camp should not be evacuated, that very night the SS officers showed up and said they had orders to evacuate the camp. The plan was to take the remaining prisoners to a central camp and then within 48 hours send them to Switzerland to be exchanged with other prisoners of war. The SS officers behaved so kindly that we couldn't believe these were the same torturous SS. The SS tried to make us get on the trucks without fear, saying we should be grateful for our good fortune. Those who still had any strength left got on the trucks. Those who were completely exhausted were laboriously lifted and placed in the trucks. There was no longer any need for my friend and me to hide our backpacks. We stood in the last group. They had to select 13 people from this group and send us on the second to last truck. The head of the doctors counted the required number, but he overlooked us. 13 people got on the truck, and we too were left behind. We were astonished, upset, and disappointed. We blamed the doctor. He excused himself, pleading tiredness and annoyance, because he had thought that we too still intended to escape. With our backpacks on our backs, in a state of utmost impatience and restlessness, we sat down with the remaining prisoners and waited for the last truck. We had to wait a long time. Finally, we lay down on the mattresses in the empty guard room. We spent the moments in hope and despair. We slept in our clothes and shoes, ready to travel. We worked to the sound of gunfire and cannons. The light of shells and the sound of guns and cannons poured into the hut. The head doctor rushed into the hut and ordered us to lie down on our stomachs on the floor. As soon as one of the prisoners heard the doctor's order, he jumped from his bunk onto my stomach with his shoes. I woke up and saw that I was still unharmed. And at that moment, we understood what had happened. The battlefront had reached our camp. The shooting subsided, and dawn broke. Outside on a pole at the camp gate, a white flag fluttered in the wind. Several weeks later, we realized what games fate had played with the remaining prisoners even in those last hours. We saw how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. Photos came into my hands taken of a small camp, not far from ours. Our friends, who that night thought they were going to freedom in the trucks, had been transferred to this camp and were burned there in locked huts. I could recognize their half-burned bodies. I remembered Azrael in Tehran. The prisoners' apathy, besides being a defense mechanism, was a product of other factors. This apathy was a product of hunger and lack of sleep, as also happens in normal life. It was also a product of the irritability that was a mental characteristic of the prisoner. Lack of sleep was also due to the presence of irritating lice in the overcrowded huts, which multiplied due to the lack of hygiene and cleanliness. Irritability and apathy could also be due to not drinking coffee and not smoking cigarettes. In addition to physical motives, psychological motives also played a role, manifesting as special complexes. For example, most prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. Before our captivity, each of us thought we were someone. But in the camp, we were valued less than a penny. Belief in one's intrinsic worth depends on spiritual and higher grounds, which camp life could not shatter. But how many free people possess this spiritual conduct that we expect from prisoners? The ordinary prisoner lived in captivity without thinking about this reality. He felt that he had completely fallen by human standards. This became clear when one examined the conflicts arising from the exceptional sociological structure of the camp. The most prominent prisoners, the capos, the cooks, the shopkeepers, the camp police, generally did not feel degraded like most prisoners. Rather, they felt that an honor had been bestowed upon them. Some of them even felt a sense of greatness. The mental reaction of most prisoners towards this favored minority group was one of intense envy and grumbling, which manifested in various ways, sometimes as jokes and witticisms. For example, a prisoner would say to another about a capo, "Just imagine, I knew this man when he was just the head of a bank. Isn't he lucky to have risen to such a high position?" As soon as a confrontation arose between the despised majority and the elevated minority, and such conflicts were not few, it usually started with the distribution of food. The result was an explosive situation. Therefore, when these psychological pressures increased, the general irritability, whose physical factors we discussed earlier, also intensified. It is no wonder that these pressures often led to fights. Since the prisoner constantly witnessed other prisoners being whipped, a desire for violence would arise within him. I myself, when hungry and tired, would feel my blood boil and clench my fists. We were allowed to light a stove in the typhus patient's hut. To keep the stove from going out, I would stand guard until morning. For this reason, I was often very tired and exhausted. The most dreamy hours for me were those nights when the others were either asleep or delirious. In the depths of those nights, I could lie down in front of the stove and roast a few stolen potatoes over the fire, whose coals were also stolen. But the next day, I would be more tired, more numb, and more irritable. With my effort in presenting this psychological study and explaining the psychopathology of the specific characteristics of concentration camp prisoners, I may have created the impression in your mind that man is completely and inevitably influenced by his environment. Of course, in this case, the environment is the unique prison environment, which forced the prisoner to adapt his behavior to an accepted pattern. So what becomes of human freedom? Is there no spiritual freedom regarding behavior and reaction to the existing environment? Is it true that man is nothing but a product of environmental factors and conditions, whether biological, psychological, or sociological in nature? Is man a random product of these factors? Most importantly, does the prisoner's reaction to the unique world of the labor camp prove that man cannot escape the influence of his environment? Does man, when faced with such conditions, not have the right to choose his actions? We can answer these questions fundamentally and from experience. The accumulated experiences of camp life show that man does have the right to choose his actions. There are examples, often of a heroic nature, that prove that man can overcome apathy and control irritability. Man can preserve his spiritual freedom, even in such horrific conditions of mental and physical pressure. We who lived in the labor camps saw with our own eyes men who would go to other huts to comfort others, giving them their last piece of bread. True, the number of such men was small, but it proves that everything can be taken from a human being except one thing, the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's own behavior in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. We in the camp were faced with opportunities every hour of every day, and we had to make decisions. Decisions about whether to submit to the forces that threatened us, threats to rob us of ourselves and our inner freedom. A decision that determined whether we would be playthings of circumstance, robbed of freedom and greatness, and molded into the shape of a typical prisoner. If we look at it from this perspective, we see that the psychological reactions of labor camp prisoners must be something more than an expression of special physical and sociological conditions. Although the unfavorable living conditions, lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various psychological pressures cause the prisoner to react in a certain way, the final analysis shows that the prisoner's inner transformation is the result of his own inner decision, not just the result of camp life influences. Therefore, in principle, any man can decide, even in such conditions, how he will change spiritually and mentally. He can preserve his human value even in the labor camp. Dostoevsky said, "I fear only one thing, that I may not be worthy of my suffering." After getting to know prisoners whose behavior in the camp, whose sufferings and deaths, bore witness to the fact that the last freedom can never be lost, I remember Dostoevsky's words, because I saw with my own eyes that they were worthy of their suffering. The way they accepted and bore their suffering spoke of a pristine inner greatness, and it was this spiritual freedom that no one could take from us, and it was this spiritual freedom that made life meaningful and purposeful. Active life gives man the opportunity to realize values through creative work. Passive life, leisure, offers an opportunity to achieve perfection through the experience of beauty, art, or nature. But even in a life that is neither active nor passive, which offers us the possibility of higher ethical behavior, a purpose is hidden. For example, in the human tendency toward one's own existence, an existence limited by external forces. The prisoner was deprived of both creative and leisurely life, but creativity and joyful living alone do not enrich life. If life has any meaning at all, then suffering must also have meaning. Suffering is the ineradicable part of life, even if in the form of fate and death. Human life would not be complete without suffering and death. The way a person accepts his fate and all his sufferings, the way he carries his cross, gives him the opportunity to add a deeper meaning to his life, even in the most difficult conditions. Such a life will always shine heroically, with dignity and freedom. And there were those who, in the struggle to save their lives, forgot their human greatness and became like animals. And here it is that man either uses the opportunities presented by his difficult situation to achieve ethical values, or he turns away from them. And this choice determines whether he is worthy of his suffering or not. Do not think these are otherworldly matters, outside our real life. The reality is that the number of those worthy of reaching such high ethical standards is very few. Among the prisoners, Only a handful preserved their full inner freedom and attained those values that were the gift of their sufferings. But even a single example proves that man's inner strength can stir him and make him victorious over his external fate. It is not only in the labor camp that one can find such men. Everywhere man is faced with fate and with the opportunity to achieve something through his sufferings. Consider, for example, the fate of patients, especially those who are incurable. Once I came across a letter from a disabled young man to a friend, saying that he had little time left, and even surgery would be useless. He wrote that he remembered a film in which a man bravely and heroically awaited death. This disabled boy thought that the man's confrontation with death showed his perfection, going to meet death so magnanimously, accepting material nothingness. Years ago, a film called Resurrection, based on one of Tolstoy's books, was shown. Those of us who saw that film also had such thoughts, because it was full of the fate of great men. Although at that time we had neither faith of that magnitude nor hope of reaching such a high degree. In other words, we didn't have the opportunity to achieve such greatness. After seeing that film, we went to the nearest tea house, and after drinking a cup of coffee and eating a sandwich, we forgot the strange metaphysical thoughts that had crossed our minds for a moment. But when we ourselves were faced with a great destiny, and we decided to accept it with spiritual greatness, we had long forgotten all those youthful solutions and had fallen. Perhaps someday some of us would see that film or something like it again. But now the matter was different, because perhaps at that same time we were seeing with our mind's eye images of those who had achieved things in their lives, whose content was far more than the content of an emotional film. Perhaps some of the details of the inner greatness of a certain man, like the story of the young woman whose death I witnessed in the labor camp, also passed through your mind. This story is very short. I cannot say much about it, as if it were a product of my own imagination, but to me the story is like poetry. The heroine knew she would die within a few days, but when I spoke with her, she was in good spirits. She told me, "I am grateful to my fate for dealing me such a heavy blow, because in my former life, I was spoiled and self-satisfied, and I didn't take spiritual perfection seriously." Then, pointing to the hut window, she said, "In my lonely moments, this tree is the only friend that stands before me." This woman could only see a single branch of a chestnut tree through the window, with 2 buds on it. She told me I often talked to this tree. I was astonished. I didn't know what to say. Was this woman delirious? Was she having a nightmare? Eagerly I asked her, "Does the tree answer?" She said yes. I asked, "What does it say?" She said, "It says, I am here, I am here, I am life, I am eternal life." As I mentioned earlier, what ultimately changed the prisoner's mental and inner state was not so much dependent on the physical as psychological conditions of the prison environment, but was the result of the prisoner's free decision. Psychological studies of prisoners have shown that only those men ultimately fell victim to the destructive influences of camp life who allowed their spiritual and moral character to decline. The question arises, what could or should have created such inner strength in us? When former prisoners talk or write about their experiences, they say that what most torments and weakens the prisoner's spirit is that he does not know how long his imprisonment will last. In the camp, the prisoner did not know his release date. Talking about it was meaningless. In fact, the duration of imprisonment was unknown and indefinite. A prominent research psychologist believes that life in a concentration camp is a provisional life. It is better to complete this phrase and call it an indefinitely provisional life. Newcomers knew nothing about the conditions of camp life. Those who had returned from other camps were forced to remain silent, and from some camps, no one had returned at all. In the prisoner's mind, upon entering the camp, certain upheavals occurred. With the end of ambiguity and doubt, the uncertainty about the end of the prison term gave rise to another ambiguity in his heart about the final outcome of the prison sentence. Because it was impossible for the prisoner to know whether this form of life would ever end. The Latin word finis has 2 meanings, end or goal. A man who cannot foresee the end of his provisional life cannot aim for a final goal. He can no longer live for the future, unlike others in normal life. And for this reason, the whole structure of his inner life is overturned. We see signs of this decline and fall in other stages of life as well. For example, an unemployed worker is in a similar situation because his life is provisional. In other words, he cannot live for the future or have a goal. Research on unemployed minors shows that they suffer from a special transformed stage arising from the disordered situation of their unemployment. Prisoners also suffered from this strange stage of experience. In the camp, the prisoners spent a time unit, say, a day, hour by hour, in torment. It seemed endlessly exhausting. A longer time unit, like a week, passed quickly. I believe that a day in the camp seemed longer than a week. My friends agreed with me. What we experienced regarding the passage of time was astonishing. Here, one remembers Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which contains some remarkable psychological insights. Mann studied the spiritual development of those in a similar psychological situation, for example, tuberculosis patients in a sanatorium who didn't know when they would be discharged. They too experienced a similar life without a goal or future. One prisoner, who upon arrival had marched in a column from the train station to the camp, later told me that at that moment he felt like he was attending his own funeral, because he saw his life as completely without a future, and felt life so ended as if he were dead. Of course, this feeling of death was intensified by other factors, temporally by the indefinite duration of his imprisonment, which he felt acutely, and spatially by the narrow confines of the camp, which tormented him. Everything beyond the barbed wire seemed desolate, out of reach, and in a word, unreal. People and events outside the camp, all of normal life, took on a dreamlike quality. The outside world, as far as he could see, seemed as if a dead man were looking at it from another world. Someone who sees no goal in the future inevitably succumbs to retrospection, ruminating on past thoughts, which causes his downfall. Earlier, we spoke about the tendency towards retrospection, which enabled the prisoner to endure the present better. This mechanism enabled the person to make the horror of the present unreal. But stripping the present of its reality was itself dangerous, because then we would overlook the opportunities that arose, opportunities that really existed and could have given a positive meaning to camp life, and would easily pass them by. Given our provisional life, which itself was unreal and a significant factor, it could cause life to lose its balance. In other words, everything became meaningless. These prisoners forgot that such difficult, exceptional conditions often give a person the opportunity to step beyond themselves spiritually. Instead of considering the camp's difficulties as a touchstone for their inner strength, they didn't take life seriously and despised it as something that would lead to nothing, preferring to close their eyes and live in the past. Of course, life also became meaningless for such people. Naturally, only a few reached the highest peak of spirituality, but a small number did have this opportunity to achieve human greatness, even despite their apparent worldly failures and death. And this was a perfection they could never have achieved under normal circumstances. For the rest of us, ordinary and disinterested people, Bismarck's saying was true: life is like going to the dentist, because you're always waiting for the most painful moment, while those moments have already passed. That aside, I can say that most men in the labor camp believed they had lost life's real opportunities. Yet in reality, these opportunities and struggles still existed. Man could be victorious even in these experiences, steering his life towards inner victory, or conversely give up the struggle and, like most prisoners, choose a vegetative life. Any effort to combat the effects of mental illness in the prison environment on the prisoner, whether through psychotherapy or other mental hygiene methods, must be based on this principle: to arouse the prisoner's inner strengths by showing him future goals, to open a window of hope. Some prisoners instinctively tried to cling to a goal, because one of the characteristics of man is that he can only live by hoping for the future. Although a prisoner sometimes had to force himself to hope for something, this pressure itself would bring about his liberation in the most difficult moments of his life. Let me relate one of my personal experiences. Writhing in pain from the sores on my feet, caused by wearing torn shoes, I was limping along with a fleshy column of prisoners from the camp to the worksite, several kilometers away. The bitter cold and harsh wind blew in my face. I constantly thought about the endless small problems of my painfully difficult life. What would tonight's food be? If they gave an extra ration of a piece of sausage, should I trade it for a piece of bread, or trade my last cigarette, which I had gotten 2 weeks ago for nothing, for a bowl of soup? How could I find a piece of wire to use instead of a shoelace? Would I be able to join my regular work group on time, or would I have to join another group with a ruthless foreman? What should I do to establish a good relationship with a capo who could help me get a job inside the camp instead of these horrible, long daily walks? I was sick to death of having to think about these trivial matters every hour of every day. I tried to occupy my thoughts with something else. Suddenly, I found myself on the platform of a warm, bright lecture hall, facing an audience of listeners sitting in soft chairs, hanging on my every word. The topic of the lecture was the psychology of the concentration camp. All the things that were pressuring me at that moment took on a scientific aspect for me. With this method, I was able, as it were, to dominate the circumstances of that moment, seeing them as if they belonged to the past. Suddenly, I and my problems became the subject of a scientific psychological study that I had undertaken myself. Spinoza says in his Ethics, "As soon as we form a clear and precise picture of our emotions, the emotions in a state of suffering cease to suffer." The prisoner who had lost hope for his future was doomed. By losing faith in the future, he also lost his spiritual anchor. He saw himself condemned to physical and mental decay and disintegration. This collapse usually happened in the form of a crisis, quite suddenly. Experienced camp prisoners knew the signs. We all feared this dreadful moment more for our friends than for ourselves. It usually started when a prisoner refused one morning to get up, get dressed, wash, or go to the parade ground. Entreaties, pressure, and threats were like pounding water in a mortar. The lost prisoner would lie where he was and not move. If this crisis coincided with an illness, the prisoner would refuse to go to the medical ward or to receive any help. In other words, he gave up on everything. He would wallow in his own filth on his bunk, and nothing bothered him anymore. As I mentioned earlier, any effort to preserve the prisoner's inner strength in the camp had to aim at showing him a goal in the future. As Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." This can be a guiding motto for all psychotherapeutic and mental hygiene efforts with prisoners. Whenever the opportunity arose, we had to give the prisoners a why, a goal, to give them the strength to endure the terrible how of their lives. Woe to him who no longer found any meaning in his life, who had no aim or purpose. He would see himself as humiliated, unable to continue living, and thus he would not last long. The answer that this lost individual gave to all hopeful discussions, and he rejected them, was, "I don't want anything from life anymore." And what answer could we give to such a person? At such a stage, what was truly and urgently needed was a fundamental change in our attitude and way of thinking about life. We not only had to reconstruct such a state within ourselves, but we also had to teach other lost and depressed men that what matters is what life expects of us, not what we expect from life. We should no longer ask about the meaning of life, but rather think of ourselves as those who are questioned by life. Daily and hourly, we must answer. Our answer should not be in words and thoughts, but in right action and behavior. Because ultimately, life means being responsible for finding the right answer to its problems and fulfilling the tasks that are constantly placed before each individual. These tasks, and consequently the meaning of life, manifest differently for different people and from moment to moment. Therefore, it is impossible to define the meaning of life or give a universal formula. We can never answer questions about the meaning of life with broad, general statements. Life is not something vague. On the contrary, it is something very real and tangible, just as the tasks present in life are very real and tangible. These tasks shape the destiny of the individual, which is unique to them. No individual or destiny can be compared to another. No situation repeats itself, and each situation requires a different response. Sometimes the situation a man finds himself in requires him to shape his destiny through the actions he takes in response to that situation. Sometimes it will be more beneficial for him to use the opportunity and contemplate what is, what exists. Sometimes it is necessary to bear a bad fate and its sufferings. Each situation is defined by its uniqueness, and there is always a right answer to every problem that presents itself. When a person realizes that his fate is to suffer, he must accept his suffering as a duty, an exceptional and unique duty. He must accept this truth, that even in suffering he is alone in the world. No one can rescue him from his suffering or suffer in his place. The only opportunity lies in how he confronts his problems and bears his hardships. For us prisoners, these thoughts were not divorced from reality, and they helped us, because even in the worst conditions, when there seemed to be no way out, they freed us from despair. We had long since passed the stage of asking about the meaning of life, the simple question that says life means achieving a goal through active creativity. But for us, the meaning of life encompassed a wide range of life and death, suffering and dying. When we understood the meaning of suffering, we refrained from reducing or lessening the camp's torments by ignoring them or by having false, wishful thinking and superficial optimism. In fact, suffering had become a duty for us that we did not want to shirk. We had realized the hidden opportunities of suffering for perfection, opportunities that led the German poet Rilke to write, "How much suffering we must undergo." Rilke spoke of suffering the way others speak of working. We had to suffer much, so we had to confront these sufferings and try to minimize moments of weakness and secret tears. But we need not be ashamed of our tears, for these tears themselves bear witness that man bears his suffering courageously and with head held high. But only a few realized this. Some prisoners admitted with shame that they had cried, like the friend I asked how he had cured his foot. He said, "I expelled it from my body with tears." When psychotherapy or mental hygiene began in the camp, we were able to treat individuals in groups. The efforts of individual psychotherapy were often a kind of life-saving, usually to prevent suicide. The camp's strict regulations made any attempt to save a man who intended to commit suicide difficult. For example, cutting the rope a prisoner was trying to hang himself with was forbidden, so preventing such events from occurring was very important. I remember 2 cases that could have led to suicide, very similar to each other. Both prisoners had talked about their intention to commit suicide, giving the usual reason: they expected nothing more from life. In both cases, we had to make them understand that life still expected something from them. In fact, we realized that one of them had a child in a foreign country waiting for him. A child he loved devotedly. For the second one, it was something non-personal. The second man was a scientist who had written a series of books and needed to finish them. No one else could take this scientist's place, just as no one else could take that father's place for his child. This uniqueness and singularity, which distinguishes each individual from another and gives meaning to their existence, is as effective in creative works as in human love. When we realize the impossibility of replacing one individual with another, we become aware of the individual's responsibility for their own existence. A man who is aware of his responsibility towards a human being who eagerly awaits him, or towards an unfinished work, will never be able to commit suicide. He also knows his why, and will have the strength to cope with almost any how. Naturally, there was little opportunity for group therapy in the camp. Sometimes a genuine example was far more effective than words. The senior camp guard, who was not in sympathy with the camp authorities, used thousands of opportunities with his just and encouraging behavior, having an astonishing moral effect on those under his command, because immediate effect is always more powerful than words. But sometimes words were not without effect, especially when mental receptivity was intensified due to some external conditions. I remember one such occasion when we had to work on the prisoners of a hut whose mental receptivity was intensified due to a special external situation. It was a bad day. During the roll call, they announced that from then on, many actions would be considered sabotage, and the guilty person would be immediately hanged. These crimes included cutting a strip from a worn blanket for a wristband, minor thefts. A few days earlier, a hungry prisoner had entered the potato store and stolen some. The theft was discovered, and some prisoners identified the thief. When the news reached the camp authorities, they ordered that either we turn in the thief, or the entire camp would go without food for a whole day. Naturally, 25,000 people decided to fast. That evening, the fasting prisoners were lying gloomily in their huts, no one speaking. At that time, any word felt like a hammer blow to our heads. Worse still, the electricity went out. Everyone's spirit was at its lowest ebb. But our senior guard, a wise man, started to talk about everything that was on our minds at that moment. He spoke of friends who had died in the past few days, whether from illness or suicide. But he also noted that he knew the real cause of their death was that they had given up hope. He believed there must be a way to prevent such events from happening in the future, to keep future victims from reaching this mental state. He asked me to be a guide for the prisoners. God knows I had no patience for psychological explanations or sermons, or to give my friends instructions on self-care. I was cold and hungry, irritable and tired, but I had to try, and I had to use this exceptional opportunity. Encouragement was needed now more than anything. With this thought, I began my talk, which was soothing in nature. I said that even in Europe, in the 6th winter of World War II, our situation wasn't as terrible as we thought it should be. I said that each of us must ask ourselves what irreplaceable things we had lost. I thought that for most prisoners, the amount of what they had lost was truly small. Anyone who was still alive had reason to hope. The health of one's family, happiness, professional abilities, wealth, social status, all could be regained. Besides, our bones were still healthy. Everything we had been through could be useful to us in the future. Then I repeated Nietzsche's phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Then I spoke about the future. I said that from any objective point of view, the future looked very dark. I believed that each of us could guess how slim his chances of survival were. I told them that although typhus had not yet become epidemic in the camp, their chances of survival were very low. My own chance was about 5%. Yet I had no intention of giving in to despair. Because no one knows what will happen in the future, even in the next hour. And besides, a thrown apple spins thousands of times before it hits the ground. Even if we don't expect any military events in the next few days, who knows better than us, with all our camp experience, what sudden chances can arise. For example, a prisoner might be unexpectedly transferred to a special group, enjoying an exceptionally good work situation, for it was these things that determined the prisoner's chance. In my speech to the hungry prisoners, I not only spoke about the future and the veil drawn over it, but also about the beauty and light of the past, which shone in the darkness of our present life. To avoid a preaching tone, I quoted a poet. "No power in the world can take from you what you have experienced." Not only our experiences, but everything we have done, all the great thoughts we have had, and all that we have suffered, nothing has been lost. Even though all this is past, we have given it existence, because being is a form of existence, perhaps its most certain form. Then I spoke about the many opportunities that give life meaning. I told my friends who lay motionless, sighing occasionally, that human life in any condition can never be meaningless, and that this infinite meaning of life includes deprivation and death. I asked these lost souls, who were listening intently to my words in the darkness of the hut, to realize the critical nature of their situation. Not only should they not give up hope, but they must believe that the apparent futility of our struggle would not diminish its grandeur and meaning. They must maintain their courage. I told them that in these difficult and deadly hours, a friend, a wife, alive or even dead, or God himself, had their eyes on us and expected not to be disappointed. He hoped to see us suffer with heads held high, not with misery and humiliation, and that we had learned the art of dying. Finally, I spoke of sacrifice that finds meaning in every situation. It is in the nature of this sacrifice that the material, natural world looks upon it with astonishment and finds it meaningless, while in reality, our sacrifice had a profound meaning. I told them frankly that those with religious faith would understand this easily. I recounted the story of a friend who, upon entering the camp, had made a pact with his God to accept suffering and death so that someone he loved would not suffer a terrible fate. For this man, suffering and death were meaningful. His sacrifice had a very deep meaning. He didn't want to die for nothing, just as none of us wanted to die that way. My aim in using all these words was to find a meaning for the prisoners' lives at that time, in that hut, in that deadly situation. And I was witness to my own successful effort, because when the electricity came back on, I saw the emaciated figures of my friends staggering towards me with tearful eyes to thank me. But I must confess that I rarely had the strength to share in their sufferings, and by this measure it seems I had missed countless opportunities to do so. And now we come to the third phase of a prisoner's psychological reactions, the psychology of the prisoner after liberation. But before clarifying this issue, I must address a question often asked of psychologists, especially a psychologist who was himself a prisoner. What is your opinion on the psychological behavior of the camp guards? How is it possible that a human being of flesh and blood could behave towards others the way many prisoners describe. When one hears these horrific stories, and when one believes that everything the prisoners recount actually happened and is not myth, one asks oneself, how is it psychologically possible for one human being to torture another like that? To answer this question without going into details, we must point out a few things. First, among the guards or wardens there were some who were sadists or tormentors in the true clinical sense. Second, when the camp authorities needed people for difficult missions, they selected them from among these tormentors. When we were allowed, after 2 hours of exhausting work in the freezing cold, to warm ourselves by a fire made of wood scraps, we were overjoyed. But even in these short moments of happiness, there were foremen who took great pleasure in depriving us of that joy, when they not only prevented us from standing by the fire, but also scattered that beautiful fire on the snow. The light of pleasure shone in their eyes. There were always prisoners who specialized in torture and abuse. When the SS didn't like someone, they would hand him over to these tormentors. Third, most of the guards, after years of working in the camp and observing its brutal and savage methods, had become emotionally deadened in their torture of prisoners. These men, hardened morally and psychologically, at least refrained from playing an active role in tormenting, but they no longer prevented others from doing so. Fourth, among the guards there were also those who felt sorry for us.
As an example, I will only mention the commander of the camp from which I was liberated.
After our liberation, it turned out that this commander had spent a considerable sum of his own money to buy medicine for his prisoners from the nearest market. Only the camp doctor, himself a prisoner, knew this, and no one else. But the senior camp guard, himself a former prisoner, behaved more harshly than any SS officer. While the camp commander, as far as I know, never raised a hand against us. This guard would beat prisoners at the slightest opportunity. So knowing whether a man was a camp guard or a prisoner doesn't solve anything. Human kindness is found in every group, even in those we readily condemn. The boundaries between groups have a common ground, and we should not reach a conclusion by saying that these men are angels and those others are demons. Certainly when a guard or a foreman, despite all the camp's controls, behaved kindly towards prisoners, he was taking a positive, human step. But how can one justify the meanness of a prisoner who behaved so improperly towards his fellow prisoners? It is clear that the weak character of such men was shocking to the prisoners, while they were deeply moved by the slightest kind gesture from any guard. For example, the day a foreman secretly gave me a piece of bread that I have no doubt he had saved from his own breakfast ration. At that moment, it wasn't the piece of bread that brought tears to my eyes, but something of humanity that this man gave me, the words and the look that spread across his face and caressed my ears as he gave me the bread. From all that I have told you, we understand that in the world there are only two races, the race of complete men and the race of incomplete men. These two races are found everywhere, for they permeate all social groups. One can never say that this group is completely complete and that group completely incomplete. Thus, no group is of pure race. Therefore, we occasionally encountered such complete individuals, even among the guards. Life in the labor camp dissects the depths of the human soul and reveals its profundity. Is it astonishing that in those depths of the human soul, I once again encountered only those characteristics of man whose nature is a mixture of good and evil? The divide that separates good from evil passes through all human beings, reaches the lowest level, and is revealed even in the highest things that the concentration camp established. And now, in the final chapter of the psychology of the concentration camp, we come to the psychology of the liberated prisoner. In describing the experiences of liberation, which naturally must be my own experiences, I will focus on that part, starting from the morning, when after days of anxiety, the white flag flew over the camp gates. At this time, our inner state of confusion turned into rest. But if we say we went crazy with joy, we would be mistaken. So what happened? We prisoners dragged ourselves on tired legs towards the camp gates. We looked around with fear and apprehension, questioning each other with sideways glances. Then we took a few steps outside the camp. This time no one shouted at us, and there was no need to dodge a kick or a blow. Not only that, the guards even offered us cigarettes. At first, we didn't recognize them, because they had quickly changed out of their uniforms into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road that branched off from the camp. Our feet hurt and might twist at any moment, but we still limped along, wanting to see the surroundings of the camp for the first time with the eyes of free men. We repeated to ourselves, freedom. But we still couldn't believe we were free. For so many years we had longed for freedom, and we had spoken the word so often that it had lost its meaning. The reality of freedom could not penetrate our consciousness. We could not accept the truth that freedom was now ours. We reached a grassy field, saw the flowers, and remembered that they had always been there, but we had felt nothing for them. The first spark of joy filled us when we saw a rooster with colorful tail feathers, but this spark remained like a blind spot, because we did not belong to this world. In the evening, when we gathered again in our huts, one whispered to another, "Tell me, were you happy today?" And the man said shamefacedly, "To tell you the truth, no. In fact, we had lost the feeling of being happy, of becoming happy. We had to relearn this art of being happy." What happened psychologically to the liberated prisoners was called depersonalization. Everything seemed unreal, like a dream. We didn't believe that what we saw was real. In past years, how often we had been fooled by dreams. We dreamed that the day of liberation had come, that we were free, that we had returned home, that we were welcoming our friends, embracing our wives, sitting at a table, talking about what had happened to us, and even about the dreams we had of the day of liberation. And then the prison guard's whistle would end our dream of freedom, and now these dreams had come true. But could we believe it? The body has fewer inhibiting forces than the mind, and from the very first moment makes maximum use of freedom. After gaining freedom, the prisoner would eat for hours and days, even in the middle of the night, like a starving man. What is astonishing is the amount a person can eat. When a villager who had made friends with one of the prisoners invited him to his house, the prisoner ate non-stop, drank coffee, and when he had calmed down a little, he talked for hours, and finally, he was freed from the pressure that had tormented his mind for years. Listening to him, one felt that he was compelled to talk, that he could not resist his urge to speak. I knew people who showed such reactions only for a short time, for example, during Gestapo interrogations. Days passed until the prisoner not only began to talk non-stop, but something else blossomed in him. Feelings that had been silenced suddenly broke their chains. A few days after liberation, I walked for kilometers through a village and a flowery meadow. My destination was a market near the camp. Skylarks were flying up into the sky, and I heard their joyful songs. There was no one to be seen. I saw nothing but the vast earth, the expanse of sky, the cheerful song of the skylarks, and the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around me, and gazed at the sky. Then I knelt down. At that moment, I had forgotten myself and the world. Only one sentence was in my mind, the familiar sentence I had recited to myself. I called out to my Lord from my small prison, and he answered me in the vast expanse of freedom. How long I knelt there repeating that sentence, I don't remember. What I do know is that on that day, at that hour, my new life began. Step by step I moved forward until I became myself again, a human being. The path we had to traverse from the tension and mental pressure of those last days in the camp, from that war of nerves to mental peace, was certainly not free of obstacles. If we thought that a liberated prisoner no longer needed spiritual care, we were mistaken. On the contrary, we had to pay attention to this reality. A man who had been under such psychological pressure for so long, especially when that pressure was suddenly released, is naturally at risk after his liberation. This risk is the psychological reaction to that pressure. Just as a submarine crewman's physical health is at risk if he suddenly leaves his chamber. Therefore, a man suddenly freed from psychological pressure is very vulnerable, morally and mentally. Those with a more primitive nature than others, at this psychological stage, cannot escape the effects of the brutalities of camp life. Now that they have freedom, they think they can use it dissolutely and tyrannically. The only thing that has changed is that now they are the oppressors, not the oppressed. They have moved from being objects to becoming subjects who oppress with their own willpower and motives. They justify their behavior with their own bitter and horrific experiences, which is often evident even in small events. For example, one day, as a friend and I were walking hand in hand from a farm towards the camp, we suddenly came to a field of green wheat. I involuntarily tried not to trample it, but my friend grabbed my hand and dragged me through the wheat. I resisted, saying, "We shouldn't trample the young wheat." My friend got angry. He gave me a furious look and shouted, "Isn't what they took from us enough? They sent my wife and child to the gas chamber, and now you're scolding me for trampling a few stalks of wheat?" Only with patience and forbearance could one make these men understand that no one has the right to do wrong, even if they have been wronged. We had to persistently lead them towards this truth, otherwise, results more dire than losing a few thousand stalks of wheat would ensue. I still remember a prisoner who rolled up his sleeves, put his right hand under his eye, and shouted, "May this hand of mine be cut off, if, when I return home, I do not dip it in the blood of the oppressors." I emphasize that the speaker of these words was not a bad man. On the contrary, he was my best friend in the camp and after liberation. Besides the moral sickness resulting from sudden release from pressure, two other fundamental experiences threatened the liberated prisoner's personality: the bitterness of post-liberation life and the disillusionment upon returning to one's former life. The bitterness of life was due to the things he encountered in his town, in the sense that when he returned to his town, he was often greeted with coldness and handed cliched sentences. For this reason, he would become a bitter person, asking himself why he had endured so much suffering and hardship. When he heard the same cliched sentences from people, "We didn't know," or "We suffered too," he would ask himself, "Don't they have any better sentences to say?" But the problem and experience of disillusionment is something else. Here it was no longer a matter of a friend's superficiality and lack of feeling, which was repulsive, to the point where the person would eventually feel like crawling into a corner, hearing no human voice and seeing no human face. It was a matter of fate, which had crushed him so unjustly and mercilessly. A man who thought for years he had touched the absolute limit of all possible suffering would come to the conclusion that suffering knows no limits and that he still had to suffer, more than before. When we spoke earlier about the effort to create psychological courage in a prisoner in the camp, we aimed to open a window of hope for him in the future. We had to remind him that life was still waiting for him, that a person was waiting for his return. But after liberation, some prisoners discovered that no one had ever been waiting for them. Woe to him who saw that the person whose memory had given him hope in the camp no longer existed. Woe to him who, when his dream came true and he finally gained freedom, found freedom to be completely different from what he had longed for. Perhaps he would get on a tram, go to the house he had cherished in his mind for years. In his inner world, he would ring the doorbell, just as he had done in 1,000 dreams, only to realize that the person who should open the door was no longer there, and never would be. We all told each other in the camp that no worldly joy could compensate for all the suffering we had endured. We had not set our hearts on the happiness of the day of liberation. It was not hope that gave us courage and meaning to our sufferings, our sacrifices, and our dying, but we were also not prepared for grief and sorrow. This disillusionment, which awaited a large number of prisoners, was a bitter experience that crushed many. It was difficult even for a psychiatrist to help them overcome their grief-stricken state. But this should not discourage the psychiatrist. On the contrary, it should serve as a new motivation. For every liberated prisoner, a day will come when, looking back at his period of captivity and examining his camp experiences, he will not believe that he endured such a difficult time and made such a journey. Just as the day of his liberation finally came and everything seemed like a beautiful dream, so too will a day come when his camp experiences will torment him like a nightmare. These precious experiences create a profound feeling in the man who is stepping towards his home, that after all the suffering his soul has endured, there is nothing left for him to fear except God. The striving to find meaning in life is the most fundamental driving force of every individual during his lifetime. This striving to find meaning in one's own life is an original and basic force, not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives. This meaning is unique and specific to him, and therefore he and only he must and can fulfill it. Only then will his search for meaning be satisfied. In my view, man is able and can live for his ideals and values, or die in their service. A few years ago, a public opinion poll was conducted in France. The result showed that 89% of the participants stated that man needs something to live for, and 61% declared that there was someone or something in their lives for which they were willing to die. I conducted a similar survey in my clinic in Vienna among patients and staff, and the result was exactly the same as the French survey of several thousand people, with only a 2% difference. In other words, these studies showed that the search for meaning is a reality for most people, not just a belief or opinion. According to Jean-Paul Sartre, man is the maker of himself, the designer of his own essence. In other words, man determines his own nature as it is and as it should be. Although I believe that the meaning of our existence is not made and fabricated by us, but rather we seek and discover it. Mental health requires a certain amount of tension, the tension between what one has achieved and what one must fulfill. The struggle to bridge the gap between what is and what should be. This tension is necessary for human life. Therefore, we should not be afraid of man's struggle to find the potential meaning of his own life. It is only by this means that we awaken his search for meaning. What man needs is not balance in the absence of tension, but a striving towards a worthy goal. What man needs is not merely the relief and discharge of tension at any price, but the response to a potential meaning that awaits his fulfillment, calling him towards itself. What man needs is not a vital balance, but something I have called new dynamics, the driving force of the spirit in a field of tension, at one pole of which is meaning, and at the other, the individual who must fulfill that meaning. What is the meaning of life? I doubt that anyone can give a general answer to this question, because the meaning of life differs from person to person, day to day, and even hour to hour. Therefore, what matters is not the meaning of life in general, but the specific meaning and purpose of a person's life at a given moment. This general question is like asking a chess grandmaster, what is the best move in chess? It is obvious that the best move, or even a good move, has no meaning or existence apart from a specific position in the game and without considering the opponent's personality. The same is true of human existence. The duty, mission, responsibility, and meaning of life for each person are unique, and the opportunity to fulfill it is also unparalleled. Each life situation is a golden opportunity that gives a person the chance to struggle, to be presented with a knot, to have the chance to untie it. So the question about the meaning of life must be turned back on the individual. That is, the individual should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but should know that he himself is faced with this question. In short, the individual himself is responsible for his life. He, and only he, can answer life's question, life for which he himself is duty-bound and responsible. Live as if you were living for the second time, and as if you had acted wrongly the first time. In my opinion, no general rule or motto can better awaken a sense of responsibility and duty in a person, because first it forces him to imagine that the present is the past, and then to accept that the past can still be changed and corrected. This way of thinking forces him to confront, on the one hand, the limitations of the world, and on the other, the ultimate potential of what he can make of himself and his life. Love is the only way to reach the depths of another human being's existence. No one can fully grasp the essence of another human being except through love. It is the spiritual aspect of love that helps us see the essential characteristics and real qualities of the beloved, and even to understand what is potential within them that must be realized. Moreover, the lover, through the power of love, is able to help the beloved become aware of their own talents and to fulfill them. One of the ways to find meaning in life is through suffering. When a person is faced with an unavoidable situation, or with an unchangeable fate, such as incurable diseases or certain types of cancer, he has found the opportunity to achieve the highest values and the deepest meaning of life, namely suffering. In suffering, the best manifestation of human existential value is found. What matters most is the individual's attitude and approach to suffering, and the way he bears that suffering. Sometimes in life, a situation arises where a person is prevented from doing something, or achieving success, but what is inevitable and indestructible is the suffering itself. Therefore, if we accept suffering courageously, life will have meaning until the very last breath. So, in this way, we can say that the meaning of life is not conditional, because the meaning of life can include even the potential meaning of pain and suffering. It should be noted that man's striving to find meaning and value in his life does not necessarily cause balance, and may be tension-producing, but this tension is necessary and an integral part of mental health. I dare say that there is nothing in the world that helps a person more than finding the meaning of his own existence in life. There is great wisdom in Nietzsche's saying, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how."